Congressman Mike Simpson, you are back, sir. How are you?
I am back. How are you doing? I'm doing great.
Wonderful. And guess what? This time, no remodeling upstai's. So
all right. We don't have to worry about any pounding or dust falling down or anything like that.
Well, probably not, but no promises. I asked you to come back, and you were very grateful and gracious to come back. I really wanted to talk about the Equal Access for Justice Act, because there are big problems with. There's a wonderful sentiment that spurred this act, which is essentially, hey, look, you have the average citizen that could be experiencing injustices dealt to him or her by the federal government or larger entities, right? Yeah. And that's really problematic if you're just a dude like me and you're like, well, the federal government's doing all this bad stuff. Like, what am I going to do? And so there was an act put in place that essentially allowed for compensation if somebody is victorious in a lawsuit against the federal government. So essentially hedging your bets a little bit, because a protracted, lengthy, lawsuit with the government can be quite expensive. And if you stand to just foot the bill, that's a risky proposition. Yep. The problem is, in initiating this program, which essentially set up a compensation program for legal fees and whatnot, you also created a system, not you personally, but the government created a system where you have larger environmental agencies that then realized, hey, I only have to be like 50% on when I file these lawsuits. If I file 10 lawsuits a year and each lawsuit is $100,000 in legal fee, if I'm right on 5 of them, then I get that $100,000 reimbursed. And if I raise enough money to supply funding for all of these, let's say I raise $1 million for all 10 of these lawsuits, and I get my fees reimbursed for 5 of them, well, then I get to net $500,000 because I've raised this money for this cause. And again, I know I'm bastardizing the complexities of it, but there are problems with environmental groups and other groups kind of taking up this charge and using this act to really aggressively go after the government. And at times, some people feel that it's excessive and motivated not necessarily by what's right, but what kind of generates donations.
Yeah. It was, as you said, the intent of it was absolutely correct. And that is the person that doesn't have a whole bunch of money, and when it affects Idaho is actually with a lot of public land stuff. And you think that the Forest Service or the BLM has made a bad decision that's going to adversely impact you or something like that. If you're looking at the federal government that uses all of our tax dollars, including yours, against a lawsuit against you, how do you challenge that? How do you fight that? Especially if you don't have the money. So the sentiment was, there ought to be a system where you file a lawsuit, if you win or you win part of it, that the government will reimburse your attorney's fees. And that was the intent of the law. But then, as you said, organizations, and both sides, but mostly on the environmental side, but organizations have found that it's a business model. They can actually make money on it. Sometimes we found cases where they actually, their attorneys charge the federal government a higher reimbursement rate than they actually charge the group. So, I mean, and they're not supposed to do that, but we found that goes on. And the other thing that's kind of interesting is where that money comes from is the judgment fund at the Justice Department. I one day asked the Secretary of Interior in a hearing, I said, when you lose a case and you have to pony up the money, does that come out of your budget? And surprising to me, and to him, I think also, he turned around and looked at his staff and said, kind of like, where does that come from? They didn't know where it came from. It comes out of the judgment fund. Well, how hard are you going to fight to do things right if you're not the one being paid? It's not coming out of your budget. That's just crazy. So anyway, there's a lot of challenges to reforming it so that it goes back to its original intent, because I think everybody that I know agrees that you ought to be able to exercise your rights as an American citizen to challenge a government, and it shouldn't break you to do it.
Okay, we got to back up here. So then the bottom line is you have a viable business model that has been in place and functioning for some time. And within that business model, legal entities realize, like, okay, say I bill out at $100 an hour. Well, if I know I'm going against this particular case and I know it's going to get reimbursed, then I can actually bill out and I feel good about it, right? It's like, okay, here we go. Let's jack up the rate because this is coming out of Uncle Sam's coffers. That's essentially what some entities are doing.
Yeah, that happens.
Okay. And even beyond that, like, these are not, if you're dealing with large environmental groups, I think the argument they would make is, hey, we represent average citizens.
Yeah.
But the purpose of the initial intent of the act was not to reimburse large or environmental organizations for their legal fees. The intent was, hey, we have to help people that don't have resources otherwise, or have the capacity to go after the federal government, because they're American citizens. And, again, they need judgments against the government if the government's stepping out of bounds.
That's why it's called the Equal Access to Justice Act, so that everyone has equal access to justice. And that's, as I said, the intent of the law is good, and we should maintain that intent, but we got to reform it so that we stop these practices that I think are disgraceful, frankly, in some of these groups. And the other thing that happens is these groups go around the country and they judge shop. Now, we just passed some legislation to try to prevent judge shopping. That was the No More Rogue Rulings Act that just passed the House. And I apologize. You're gonna have to help me understand this. Okay, so judge shopping would be essentially trying to find a district where you would likely have a favorable outcome based on a judge's ruling history. Yep.
And then what was the rogue ruling that you just mentioned?
And what they then do is rule on this case in a district court and put a nationwide injunction on it. So it doesn't apply just to the district he rules, but the decision applies across the country. That, I think, is a misinterpretation of what district courts are supposed to be doing. The only one that should be able to order a nationwide injunction would be the Supreme Court. So the bill we passed said there's no nationwide injunctions by district judges, and essentially you have to bring it in the jurisdiction where the offense occurred. So you can't go, hey, the D.C. Circuit Court is pretty friendly to us, so let's file a lawsuit there. So we're trying to reform that system, not to take away people's rights, but to make sure that everything is fair for everyone.
Okay. What would the details of a reform look like? And I know there's not an easy button here, right? Because you want to make sure that you maintain, quite literally, equal access to justice, 100%. So how would this work in a reform, with reform details to fix it? So you have the sentiment and you have the intent still in place, but you mitigate the profitable nature of that business model?
That's the question. That's the $64,000 question. We've been looking at this for a number of years. And, it was kind of interesting that when Secretary Zinke was the Secretary of Interior, one of his biggest frustrations is he couldn't even find out what the rulings were. He couldn't find out what the settlements were. They were all sealed. And so he's trying to get some legislation passed that would unseal a lot of these things, because the American public has the right to know. And I think if we unsealed a lot of them so that the public could see what we were paying out in these justice funds to groups that I think are abusing it, I think you'd see some reforms right then. So, but beyond that, how do you ask a very legitimate question? How do you protect the intent of the law and still stop the abuses? That's the question of how you do it. So I don't know yet. I don't have the answer to that yet, but it's something that we need to bring up in debate.
Gosh, man, what a pickle.
It is a pickle.
You don't, and even I was just, thinking in my head, all right, well, what if you had something like you limit the number of cases that can be brought forward by one entity? It's like, okay, well, but what is that? That doesn't make sense at all.
That's right.
Right. If you have, especially like if you have a law firm that specializes in this type of stuff, what you're going to say they're limited. It's like they're the ones that know the specialty information.
That's right.
That they could represent a person or a collection of people to, get some reform done. And it's like, that's not how things go. Like if you have 1,000 abuses in a year, then you should be held accountable for 1,000 abuses. If you have one in a year, then be held accountable for one.
Yeah.
But like limiting the numbers kind of
that wouldn't work.
What about doing something like you ever sign a lease? You probably haven't rented a place for a long time, but like you sign a lease and it's like the attorney's fees should for each party should not be in excess of like $500. Just put a cap on it where it's kind of like, hey, we will reimburse you, but we're not going to reimburse you with the like $1,500 an hour white glove attorneys coming out of some crazy New York firm.
I think you could do some limitations in that regard. I don't know if it's been tried, but I think you could probably do some and do it legally.
God, I would hope so.
Put some limitations
Yeah.
on it. Yeah.
So we don't.
That's what it's going to take.
So we don't know how many of these cases go to arrive at a settlement pre-judgment. We don't know how many get get to the point of judge. Like, we don't know any of that.
Well, we know when suits are when the judgment is done. I mean, we know that.
Okay.
But you can't open it up and see what was the settlement and how much was paid to who
gotcha.
and that kind of stuff. The details of the
Gotcha.
settlement. So the settlements are kind of under the covers, and that's a problem.
And again, as you pointed out earlier, if this isn't your money, like if you're the department and it's not your money,
Right.
then it's like, hey, look, just pay them $100,000 and
Yeah.
get them out of here.
Yeah.
Like, I don't want to deal with this because they're going to fight for a while. It's going to cost. We'll probably win in the end, but it's going to cost us $500,000 to win. Just pay them $100,000 and get them to go away.
Yeah. Well, it's like, if you're paying for my breakfast, I don't really care what mine costs,
Right.
because you're paying for it. Yeah. Same sort of thing.
Right. Well, there's a problem with this in malpractice insurance and insurance in general as well, which is people have realized that the larger the insurance, the more you're insured for, that becomes a target and an asset that people go after as well, because they're like, hey, if he's insured up to $5 million, let's sue him for $5 million and go
absolutely.
from there.
Yeah.
And then again, they're hyper. If they realize that you have a $5 million coverage, they're hyper motivated to find something that could potentially be worthy of that, or have an unlimited cap and just make a greater argument for it.
They want to find the deep pocket.
Right.
And oftentimes that's the federal government or the state government.
Yeah, that's us.
Yeah.
That the deep pocket's us, you and me.
Exactly.
Man, you mentioned Zinke. Now, again, Representative Zinke from Montana brought forth the public lands in public hands that you co-sponsored.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Talk to me about this, because again, they all kind of relate. We're all fighting over public lands, and public lands in particular have really come under the microscope in recent times because of concerns about excess federal spending, fraud, waste, and abuse, as everybody likes to put it. But they've also come under a lot of attention because the idea that, hey, this is an expensive thing for us to maintain. Maybe it would be better if we just, again, either gave it back to the states or put it up for public auction. And the mass of concern that came out of the wildlife enthusiasts, recreation enthusiasts, hunting, fishing enthusiasts, I have not met a single person who has ever engaged deeply and meaningfully on public lands. It's like, that's a great idea.
Yeah.
Nor do we have a great track record with doing this, right? Like there are some areas in the country that have attempted to start doing this, and it's not an overwhelming good where it's like, oh, beyond a reasonable doubt, this is obviously the best way to go. So help me understand the public lands and public hands.
Well, the western states are the ones that have the most public lands, obviously. Idaho is 64% federal land. If you go to Texas, they don't have any public lands except for maybe a park or the Alamo or something like that,
Don't forget the Alamo.
I think that's in state hands.
Yeah,
but they don't have many federal lands. And one day I had a member of Congress come up from Texas, who's a friend of mine on the Appropriations Committee, and he said, this is probably 10 years ago. He said, I know how we can solve this national debt problem. And I said, how's that? And he's dead serious. He says, let's sell off all those public lands in the West. And I looked at him and said, most people live in Idaho because we love our public lands. Now, we often bitch and moan about the way they're managed and would do things differently and stuff, but we love our public lands. We like to have access to our favorite hunting grounds or our fishing holes or hiking grounds or whatever we do out on our public lands. And he said, so I know you don't have any public lands in Texas, so why don't you go take care of Texas? I'll worry about Idaho. And he never brought it back up again. But there have been efforts in the past, and I hear rumors now of people talking about, well, that's how we can address this $37 trillion debt and at least pay down some of it is by selling off these public lands and not having to put money into it and stuff. But, if they sell off the public lands, first thing they're going to sell is the best areas.
Right.
And in Idaho, it's not like just being able to go down the road another couple of miles and take a different road to your favorite fishing hole. In Idaho, it means sometimes going around a mountain range and stuff because, and we've seen that happen in Idaho where a private individual has come in and bought land, closed off the access to the mountains behind it that people have always had since the beginning of time. And that's caused some problems. So I think Idahoans love public lands. As I said, we oftentimes complain about how they're managed and would do it differently and stuff. But the reason I live here is because I like to be able to go out and don't have any restrictions of having to get access across somebody's property or things like that. So what this bill essentially says is we're going to keep public lands in public hands, except for there's occasionally a transfer that goes on, and that's okay. But it goes through Congress and we debate it, whether it's the right thing to do or not. So we do those kind of things. But in general, we're not going to sell off public lands.
Look, if I may, and again, I am a ding dong when it comes to this stuff, but in general, if I have a spending problem and I say, hey, I'm spending too much money per month, why? And let's say I'm $100 in debt or $100,000 in debt. I'm like, I should definitely sell my car and that'll fix it. Oh, okay. Unless the car is the reason I'm $100,000 in debt, that's a really bad idea.
Yeah.
Because if I have a spending problem and I'm not spending the money on my car and and the car helps me get to work, it helps me generate revenue, it helps me do all these things, don't sell the car, man. That's a really bad idea. So even if say we could say we could wipe clean our $37 trillion in debt, say we sell every piece of public land today, boom, gonzo. You're welcome, Wilkes Brothers. That's it. It's gone. Okay, but did we solve the spending problem?
No.
Because we're going to be back to the $37 trillion in debt. That's not a long-term solution at all. That is a short-term pain, ostensibly a pain resolution problem that will not actually solve our debt because we haven't fixed the spending problem.
That's right.
Let's get back to neutral before we start purging hard assets. And I had Brian Brooks from the American Aviary Conservancy. I believe there it is. God, I hope I got that one. And we had this long conversation about the ROI with maintaining public lands. And it was something like close to 100-to-1 return, like 100x return with the amount of industry that's spurred, with the amount of, tax revenue, travel, recreate, all of these different things. If it costs us roughly I think $1.6 billion to invest in our public lands and maintain them, we get over $100 billion with economic
activity. Yeah.
There it is. Thank you. The A words are killing me today. But that's the right way to look at that, right?
Yeah.
Which is if you don't solve the spending problem, why are you purging hard assets? You're just going to be back in the same problem.
Yep. That's exactly right. And that's why DOGE is out there trying to reduce the spending, finding waste, fraud, and abuse. And some of the things they're finding are just stunning. And
are these real?
Yeah.
Are those real? Because I see it on TikTok. I'm is that real?
It actually is real, a lot of this stuff. And I think over the next few months, when the stuff comes out that they've been doing, what DOGE has been finding, people are going to be amazed. I know I am. And so that's what's going to help with the long-term spending. Now, is it causing some disruption and some pain? Sure. But anybody thought that we were going to go in and reduce the size of the federal government and that it wasn't going to be somewhat painful and there weren't going to be employees that you had to let go, was living in a fantasy land. If you're going to reduce the size of the federal government, you're not going to need as many employees. And this is not a criticism of them. They're just they're just doing a job we hired them to do that we don't want done anymore. So it's going to be a reduction of labor of our workforce, and it's going to be a reduction in some of the programs that we do. What they're finding in what was the foreign aid program?
Oh, yeah.
Can't remember the name of it right now. Yeah,
USAID.
USAID. What they were finding out, USAID has some really good things they do. But the amount of money they were spending on crazy stuff, that had Congress known of that, that it got defunded a long time ago. But we don't line item appropriate everything. So we spend money to do a certain project or a certain program. We're not really into saying you could spend it on this project and this project and this project. And that's how they get away with a lot of that stuff without us knowing about it.
And you must have seen the film from the 90s, Office Space.
Yeah.
With the Bobs.
Yeah.
Again, real comic movie, but at the end of the day, it's look, can you explain what you do here?
Yeah.
And it's a terrible, and I spoke to somebody who worked in the Forest Service for his entire career. He's like, listen, man, I don't have to, you send me an email when I'm out tracking something or trapping something or doing something, I don't have 20, I wouldn't have been able to get back. It's all right, I understand that. I don't think anybody's trying to demean or belittle, work that legitimate employees are doing. But at the end of the day, everybody knows somebody in there. It's dude, Bill doesn't do anything. Everybody knows. It's I want you to ask Bill what he does. Just don't ask me. And it's okay, can we at least get to the sentiment that, look, you give me $100,000 and they're like, look, Matt, I want you to spend $100,000. This is your money now. I want you to spend $100,000. Do a good job with it. Don't waste it. I guarantee you there's like a $5 purchase at a gas station for sunflower seeds or something dumb where it's like, okay, I didn't need, you got me. But like the spitz seeds, like I couldn't, it's like, you're going to spend a little bit. Like when you got $100,000 and like, you're all right, I'm going to waste a little bit of money. And that's
it's okay if you're wasting your money.
Right. That's the difference.
The federal government is wasting all of our money.
Right. Right. If I spend your $5 on the spit seeds, you're like, hey man, that was my money. I'm like, I know, but you gave me 100,000.
Yeah.
Like it's just a tiny portion. It's like, I don't care. Like it's a tiny portion. Let's get the tiny portion squared away. And I think everybody who I've talked to in particular that is really like a budget hawk, they always come back to, they're obviously portrayed as these, heartless, thankless people that just want to kill all the programs. It's like, listen, stop. Like at some point we have to acknowledge not everybody is as steadfast and diligent as you may be. Right. Or as I may be, with my $5 spits. At some point we have to acknowledge, look, can we just find out? Can we just ask these questions? So I'm glad to hear that, like, it is working. Are we going to get like a big readout? Like, is this going to be like the JFK drop? Like,
I think
10,000 pages.
They have the DOGE homepage. You can go look and see what they've been finding so far and stuff. So it is very interesting what they're doing, and I think it's going to have lasting impact. And as Elon Musk actually said when he was talking to several of us in a conference one day, he said, "This may be the last chance we have to save this country." And he's dead serious about it, and I agree with him, because the biggest threat facing our country today is not China, it's not Russia, it's not Iran, it's our national debt. And if we don't get that under control and headed in the right direction, all this other stuff won't matter. And we have tried in the past. We had what was called the Simpson Bowles Commission that met for, 9 months, a year or whatever, to try to reverse our trend and start reducing the size of the budget deficit and get back to a balanced budget. And it had 14 House and Senate members on it, and then it had some professionals and, economists and other people. They came out with recommendations, and do you know how many of them got enacted?
How many?
0. Steny Hoyer, the Democratic majority leader when I was several years ago, and I formed a committee in the House called the Go Big Coalition, which was Republicans and Democrats trying to come up with some plans to try to reduce the federal deficit. Where could we cut? What could, and you know how much that got enacted? 0. It may be that the only way we could solve this problem is to have someone come in from the outside, like Elon Musk, that had a president had his back, saying, okay, we're going to look at where the waste is, where the abuse is, all of that kind of stuff. And he has actually said to us, we're going to make mistakes. But when we make mistakes, we want to hear about it because we want to correct the mistakes and stuff. And they've done that. But is it painful? Is it disruptive? Yeah. Is it what the Democrats are always saying to us right now is, hey, they're coming after you. What AOC and Bernie said in Napa the other day. We're coming after your Social Security, and they're coming after your Medicare and your Medicaid and all that. All of that's nonsense. When we passed the continuing resolution, they said we were cutting funding to our veterans care. We actually increased funding to the veterans care in that CR. So it was just the opposite of what they were saying. And that's the same thing right now. Nobody that qualifies for Medicare, that qualifies for Social Security, or that qualifies for Medicaid is going to lose those services because of what we're doing. Nobody. 2 things.
Your Bernie impersonation was fantastic. 2, could you, and again, I know you're short on time today, could you just give me a broad picture of when you say the biggest threat is our national debt? Help me understand that. Why? Is it because we borrowed a lot of money at close to 0% and those bills are coming due? Is it that the ratio of GDP to our debt payment is inverting and it's like we're not going to be like, what is it? Why is that the biggest threat over very obvious adversarial governments?
Well, I will tell you that it's there's a lot of things that an economist could tell you that would more technical than what I would say. This is what frightens me is right now, the largest portion of our discretionary budget is payment on, or it's mandatory payment, is payment on the national debt. Bigger than defense. We spend more on paying interest on the national debt. Interest rates go up a little bit, that balloons. And so it's like getting close to $1 trillion a year we pay on interest on the national debt. Every year the Treasury sells, or every day the Treasury sells bonds, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day. When we get in such dire financial circumstances, and it's coming if we don't do something, that when they go out to sell bonds, no one's on the other end of the line to buy them. And who's buying them now? China, other countries. They're financing our debt. One day there's going to be a time when they go to sell bonds and there's nobody on the other end of the line. And what they tell me is that it won't be a slow decrease in our economy into a Great Depression. It will be instantaneous. That economy just goes through the floor. Not only our economy, but the world economy, because we're the world's reserve currency and stuff. So that's the challenge. But we know it's coming if we don't do something. And that's why you hear Elon and President Trump both saying, this is the biggest threat to our country, and we've got to solve this. And yes, it's going to take dramatic steps. And that's what's happening in Washington right now. And I understand people are concerned. They're worried that their favorite program is going to be cut or other things like that. There are some programs in there that have been recommended to be cut or eliminated that I really like. That it kind of bothers me that they're proposing that. But guess what? We've all got a shared burden of reducing the size of this federal government, and that's what this administration is doing. And yeah, I have empathy for those people that had jobs that are going to lose jobs and have to find jobs in the private sector now, and those types of things. But I don't know how else you'd do this. I honestly don't.
Right. And you can have empathy. You can feel for people's struggle, filling out resumes, interviews, and also say, look, if we don't have a job for you, we don't have a job for you. You don't get mad at the private sector if the private sector says we don't have a job for you.
Well, and do you know that the private sector does exactly what the federal government did, what DOGE and the administration said, which we're going to give you a retirement option. You can get paid for I think through September, and retire now. So it's an early buyout. And
I know somebody who took that.
Yeah.
Actually. Yeah.
There are thousands and thousands of federal employees that did that, thought that was their best option. Right. And I think the jobs in the future are going to be coming from the private sector as more manufacturing comes back into the United States and businesses decide to relocate into the United States. But that happens over time. And that doesn't help someone who just got laid off. Right. So we have to be sympathetic to the fact that there are going to be some challenges that we have to address for people that need help during this time. We can't just write them off and say, sorry, bye-bye. But we have to be sympathetic and empathetic to the needs of these things. So that's going to be a transition. Even Trump has said, there's going to be a transition time. I think he kind of estimates it may be too low. But I think within the next, I would say 4, 5, 6 months, you're going to see the issues with the tariffs kind of being resolved. There's 130 countries now that are asking to meet with us on their tariffs and so forth. That's a huge step in the right direction. And there will be this transition that causes some heartburn and some pain, but I think it's absolutely necessary. When you go to the doctor, you don't necessarily like to go into the surgery, but you know that it's necessary.
Right. Congressman, thank you for taking the time today. I know you're on a tight schedule. Again, this was round 2 for us. I really, really appreciate it. Is there anything you'd like to say here at the end?
Hey, I enjoy being on it, and congratulations on the success of your podcast, and I look forward to being on it again.
I look forward to it too. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. You bet.